Hello, my name is Rob Brown, and I'm an engineer with Goodwyn Mills Cawood. I work in our Brunswick, Georgia office. Thank you for selecting my presentation to listen to. We'll be discussing a case study and some research results from a green stormwater infrastructure project that was working in the coastal environment. Before we get started, this site is located in St. Mary's, Georgia. In the coming slides, we'll be going through some background and a project description. Here's some photos of St. Mary's in the downtown area pre-green infrastructure low-impact development practices. So I'd like to highlight the two photos on top. This is what conditions typically look like after rain events. Just your common everyday summer thunderstorm. There would be regular flooding, standing water, making it uncomfortable for people to be able to walk in and out of City Hall or down to the waterfront without getting ankle deep in water. This is caused by the very flat topography in the coastal environment and also a lack of drainage infrastructure in this area. The photo on the bottom, you can see the very narrow sidewalks and limited pedestrian facilities, and also just very large impervious surfaces. There's 3 travel lanes with a middle turning lane that's rarely used. And previously, with the sidewalks the way that they were configured, you would have to walk single file while walking down near the businesses down on the waterfront. So when there's a plan, there's a way. There are a number of plans that helped lead St. Mary's to this design and to this project. First, it started with the 2008 Stormwater Master Plan. This identified drainage deficiencies and that there were high priority sites on St. Mary's Street down by the waterfront, as well as on Osborne Street up by City Hall. This plan was written in 2008, so at that time, all the solutions were identified as gray approaches, adding stormwater inlets, increasing pipe sizes. In 2014, St. Mary's worked to develop a watershed management plan that followed the 9-element process of watershed planning. This enabled St. Mary's to be eligible for Section 319H grant funding from EPD because there's an impaired waterway on the St. Mary's River, and the watershed management plan identified some BMPs, or best management practices, for incorporating green infrastructure, low-impact development practices, as well as for the city to look to adopt the Coastal Stormwater Supplement. Also in 2014, St. Mary's was working on a flood resiliency plan, where it identified the downtown core being vulnerable to flooding now and increasing in the future. So there was recommendations to do stormwater improvements in this area. And then in the 2016 Downtown St. Mary's Strategic Vision and Plan, with this graphic shown on the right, an excerpt from that plan, they recommended green infrastructure practices as part of the streetscape enhancements by adding permeable pavement parking spaces and bioretention planters. So overall, the project goals were to enhance roadway and pedestrian access, and then to address those nuisance flooding issues. The city was very active in pursuing grant funding to help expand their footprint and to reach wider areas. They received an LMIG grant from Georgia DOT, and then they pursued a Section 319H grant from Georgia EPD. With the funding that was received, they were able to do 2 phases. First phase, St. Mary's Street, the dot on the bottom of the picture, and St. Mary's Street is shown on the picture on the left. And then phase 2 at City Hall, the dot at the top of the map, and then the City Hall photo is the middle photo there. So Section 319H grant funds help pay for the green infrastructure elements as part of this project. Since there were 2 project phases, St. Mary's was able to receive nearly $500,000 in grant funds, and this helped them to construct a little over 19,000 square feet of permeable pavement and 7,600 square feet of bioretention. The project also incorporated a monitoring component to evaluate the function and the performance of these practices, as well as an outreach and education component. In fall 2019, Georgia DNR Coastal Resources Division, UGA Marine Extension of Georgia Sea Grant, and GMC held a training on construction of bioretention practices, and the workshop was held on site at this location. And participants were able to observe installation of permeable pavers, as well as opportunity to discuss and talk with the contractor and city staff. Phase 1 was completed in October of 2019, and the city held a big ribbon cutting ceremony. They even got out the big scissors to reopen St. Mary's Street with this new streetscape project. So as a refresher, looking at the before photo versus after. See, it's a much more pleasant environment to be walking. And with this wider sidewalk, some of the businesses are starting to include seating and space for patrons down on the new wider sidewalk that's about 17 to 22 feet in width versus about the 4 to 5 foot width that was there prior. And it's a lot more green, both in terms of landscaping as well as in terms of stormwater management with the permeable pavers and the bioretention systems. They provide a number of benefits for stormwater treatment, both in terms of quantity and quality. And the photos on this slide are from Phase 1 on St. Mary's Street. You can see before with ankle-deep water versus after, all that stormwater runoff is infiltrating into those permeable pavers. Likewise, we saw tremendous improvements up by City Hall on Osborne Street, from the nuisance flooding all starting to infiltrate into that permeable paver and bioretention system. Here's a few other photos that were taken last spring that highlight and show off the permeable pavers and the bioretention areas, and how the streetscape has been enhanced, both in terms of pedestrian access as well as aesthetic value, and then overall water quality treatment and stormwater infiltration capability. And here's the finished site in action after all the striping has been completed. You can see the bioretention cells starting to pond up with water, and the stormwater runoff is infiltrating into the permeable pavers. So for the second half of my presentation, I'm going to focus in on the research program as well as some of the preliminary results. So as part of this project, we installed 14 shallow wells. We used Solent's level logger edges, which is a non-vented water level data logger or pressure transducer. So because it's not vented to the atmosphere, we also had to install a barometric pressure logger, and we installed that at the location of a tipping bucket rain gauge that was located in between the Phase 1 and Phase 2 sites. These diagrams on the right show the locations of those 14 pressure transducers, and the ones that were installed in the bioretention and permeable pavement systems were installed such that they could measure infiltration rates and exfiltration rates into the underlying soils. And the rain gauge was installed so that we could track rainfall intensities, rainfall event depths, and then use that information to model runoff and inflow into the system. And by incorporating the infiltration and exfiltration rates, we'll be able to model the portion leaving as overflow or bypass, and that infiltrating back into the underlying soils and not being discharged to the storm sewer system. Here are a couple photos of those wells deployed at the City Hall site for the Phase 2 location. On the left-hand side, you can see the monitoring well installed for the permeable pavement system, and this measures exfiltration rate. So it measures the rise and fall of water in the sub-base layer of the permeable pavers. And then for the bioretention cells, we have two at this location, one to measure surface infiltration and surface ponding, and the second one to measure the water level within the media layer, and then the exfiltration rate from water moving through the media and into the underlying soil. So we were able to distinguish the two profiles, the surface ponding and the media layer, based off of the depths that we installed the slots on our monitoring wells. So if it was slotted just in the surface ponding zone, it measures the rise and fall of that ponding layer. But when it's slotted through the media, we can measure the rise and fall of the water in the subsurface layer, and this measures the exfiltration rate into the underlying soils. Both sites at Phase 2 did not include an underdrain, and they had fairly sandy underlying soils. And you can see from this graph that sandy underlying soils helped these systems perform very well overall. Shortly after we installed the monitoring wells, we had a 1.71-inch rainfall event in early October. And that rainfall event occurred as about 3 different segments over an 8-hour period. First, there was about 0.2 of an inch of rain, about a 2-hour break, and then a little under half an inch, a 3-hour break, and then a little over 1 inch. So from this graphic, cumulative rainfall is on the right axis, and it moves from top down. And then on the left-hand side, this is our water level depth. And the purple line is our bioretention surface ponding depth. And then the blue line is the water level within the subbase layer of the permeable pavement. So you can see with those first two smaller portions of the event, the one that's 2/10 and about a 1/2 inch, you see a slight rise, but then the water infiltrating during the breaks in between the storms. This is called intra-event infiltration, and it can be quite substantial and create a lot more storage capacity for events larger than just the 1-inch rainfall event. We can see in the surface ponding one, the drawdown from the second stage to the third stage of this rainfall event was nearly a 1/2 foot just in that 3-hour period. On the next slide, we'll focus in on these green and orange lines as far as looking at infiltration and exfiltration rates. So the permeable pavement well, that's the blue line, is the water level within the subbase layer beneath our permeable pavement surface. And the orange line is a linear trend for the different segments. So we've found that there's a pretty substantial difference for the drawdown in the upper foot of the ponding zone versus the bottom 1/2 foot of the ponding zone. So we separated these two out. So if we just looked at water level drawdown, this is not our exfiltration rate, because we have rocks and stone incorporating a portion of this depth. So we have to multiply that drawdown rate by 40% to compute an exfiltration rate, so a depth of water moving into the subsoils per hour. So in that upper 1/2 foot, the exfiltration rate is about 9/10 of an inch per hour, and then once it gets into the bottom 1/2 of the storage gallery, it's about 1/3 of an inch per hour. Based off our well depth of about 1.3 feet, we were pretty much at capacity for this particular event. But we can see that right after rainfall ended, right around 9 o'clock, within about 9 hours, that subsurface storage was completely dewatered and ready for the next rainfall event. So this is a great system, functioning very well. Now looking at the purple line, this is the bioretention ponding zone. And the purple dashed line, this just represents the top of the mulch layer and the bottom of that slotted section in the surface ponding zone. Here from that green line, that linear trend shows that our infiltration rate into the media is at 1.4 inches per hour. So pretty substantial. And our maximum ponding depth at this site is about 1.3 feet. So after the rainfall event ended around 9 a.m., the surface ponding zone was completely drained within 15 hours. And then it's ready for its next rainfall event. So the red box here highlights the event that I had just presented from October 6th. So this is just one snippet, one rainfall event, but we've been monitoring the system for about 5 months now. And you can see from this graph how many times we've pretty much got to capacity from either the bioretention system or the permeable pavement system. I added a purple dashed line and a blue dashed line to show when we reach that capacity. So for the bioretention system, we've pretty much reached capacity about 5 or 6 times over this 5-month period. And from permeable pavement, we've reached it twice and then got really close about 2 or 3 more times as well. So these systems are functioning very well, very rapid infiltration rates. So the water is infiltrating into the subsurface layers and not being discharged into the storm sewer network. So all that stormwater runoff is being managed and treated for water quality, as well as reducing overall volumes of runoff from this site. Now the sites associated with Phase 1 down on St. Mary Street did experience a bit of tidal influence, and especially in the early part of the monitoring period, because we're experiencing king tides during the fall of 2020. The tides are actually backing up into an underdrain that ran the entire length of the project that drained into the storm sewer network. So due to this water backing up into the system, the tide flap that had been installed during construction was not very effective, so we installed a new one, a WAPRO inline tide flap, to be able to help control the water backing up into the underdrain from tidal influence from this site. Coastal Georgia experiences very wide tide shifts and tide swings, so this was a unique constraint for this site. Those were installed on October 23rd, denoted by the vertical red dashed line. So you can see pretty much after that they were installed, the impacts of water level in that underdrain layer is very less dramatic. Also showed the USGS gauging station data from I-95 on the St. Mary's River, about a few miles upstream of this location. So during that period in mid-October, that's typically when we see higher tide swings due to the king tides. But overall, the magnitude of water, and especially the depth of water in this underdrain layer, is substantially less. So I do believe it's having an impact. We'll have to wait until we get more king tides or spring tides to be able to truly evaluate the effectiveness of this system and this type of tide control. I'd like to thank you for tuning into my presentation today. I listed an email address and a phone number. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. The monitoring that we've conducted so far is about 5 months into a 12-month monitoring period, and we're looking to prepare a publication and summary report after the monitoring period is over, and we'll also be incorporating some water quality monitoring results, and be happy to share the information with you if you provide me an email address. And thanks again for your attention, and look forward to talking with you at the Q&A session.